Did you know that 90% of the world's millionaires invest in real estate? Well, I'm Angel with the Academy Presents Real Estate Investing Rocks, and I'm here to help you if you want to go for your piece of that pie.
And listen, when I was in the hospital, another thing happened. Just to give you an idea of like how scary this time was. I'm in the hospital and my white blood cell count was 258,000. I don't know if you know about white blood cell counts, but they're supposed to be like between 4 and 11,000. And I had a cousin who died about 2 years before I was diagnosed. She had leukemia. Her white blood cell count when she died was around 150, right? So when I heard I had a 250 white blood cell count, I accepted almost immediately that I was going to die. Like I believed I was going to die. My dad came into the hospital that night and he said, if you live till February, this is in, September, right? He said, if you live till February, I'm going to take you to Australia. And, I said to him, I just looked at him and I said, I'm not going to live till February, right? I'm not. I'm going to hopefully make it till Christmas so that I can have one last Christmas and I can say goodbye. I mean, that's the kind of mindset I was in, but at the same time, I was okay with it. I had done all this great stuff, I had really actually completed my bucket list, which is something that most people don't get to do in their lifetime. But the other thing is I had gotten to this point where I was like, okay, I'm okay with this. Like, I don't want to die. Like that first thought was, I don't want to die. The second thought was, if I do, I've lived a really good life and a better life than a lot of other people have. So that's the second takeaway from my story, I think is most important. Is the first one is you just don't have bad days because it's just not worth it. Like give them up now, get over it, recognize that bad and good stuff happens to everyone. But if I can go through this stuff like leukemia and bankruptcy and not have bad days, right, then you can too. But try to skip the leukemia and bankruptcy step if you can help it. And then the second takeaway is that like, you have to be really content and you have to live your life now. So you have to like pick the things that are important to you and do them now. So if you want to invest in real estate, and hopefully that's why you're watching the show today, then you should do that now. It doesn't matter that we're, in the middle of a global pandemic. And that's terrible. And there's a lot of, trauma associated with that. It doesn't matter that like we're potentially late in the real estate market cycle. I'm going to talk a little bit about that shortly. The point is like, you just got to get started and you got to do it. And that applies to everything in your life. So like, I did live past February and my dad did take me to Australia, although he didn't take me to Australia until 2013. And so, that's the picture of us or me in front of the Ayers Rock in Australia in 2013. In 2016, I was able to go with my dad to Egypt. That was the third time I'd been to Egypt. Or maybe the fourth. I don't know. I've been to Egypt a lot. I really love Egypt. I think people should go to Egypt. So the pyramids are amazing, but I got this picture of my dad standing in front of the pyramids, which is really great because like the thing is, my dad's 70, right? And if I don't do this stuff with him now, he might not be able to do it even if I can, right? And then we went last year in the fall to China, right? So good timing on that, by the way. Glad I got to China before, like, say, this year, right? Because it's a little bit different. Yeah. So that's me at the, climbing the Great Wall in China. And then in February, I climbed to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. I spent the entire month of February in Africa. I went to Ethiopia and Kenya and Tanzania. But that was sort of a life goal of mine to make it to 19,341 feet. I'll never go that high again. I'm confident of that. It was the most miserable, terrible, hardest thing I've ever done in my life, but I don't regret it at all. And the only reason I've been able to do all of this stuff is because I've gotten myself to a point in life where I can take a month off and go to Africa. Right? Not everyone can do that. And that's why I think real estate investing rocks. So that's the sort of life story stuff. So do you have any questions about that before I move on, or is it cool?
I love all the pictures. It's really awesome. I've never been anywhere outside of like the US and Mexico because I'm absolutely terrified of flying.
Well, you can drive to Canada, so you should try that because I've been to almost every province in Canada and it's amazing. But Xanax, that might be the
Okay,
trick.
so a story about Xanax. I was pregnant with either our third child or our fourth. I don't really remember. And we were at my OB, and it's February. And I fly every year in June because I score AP exams.
Sure.
And so I go to my OB. It's February. I'm like, Dr. Lamar, I'm flying in June, and I'm already freaking out. And he said, how much Xanax do you need? And which is really, it's a category X. So it's known to cause birth defects.
Yeah.
And he was still like, if you're already worried about flying and it is, February, that's going to cause a whole lot more damage than Xanax during the flight.
Sure. Yeah. So did it help?
Yeah, it helps.
Okay. Well, there. So when you want to fly to China next time, which, by the way, right now, I think China's actually probably relatively safe. But this travel stuff, like, it's going to be a minute before we can do international travel again. And so hopefully, sooner rather than later, we'll be able to get out. Like right now, I'm supposed to be in Egypt, which I realize is super ironic because I, said that I've been to Egypt a bunch of times. But I met this guy who's 79 years old and has wanted to go to Egypt since he was 7. And he's like, man, like he was introduced to me because a friend of ours said, hey, my friend Jeff's been to Egypt a bunch of times and maybe he can give you some pointers. And he just kept saying, well, I don't really want to go on a tour. I want to go on my own, but I'm afraid to go on my own. And I just said, you know what, like, let's just do it. So we were planning on going in April to Egypt, and we would just be getting home now. We were going to go for 2 weeks at the end of April, beginning of May. But obviously that didn't happen, which is, sad because I haven't been there since 2016 and I'd like to go again. I have friends there. And, that quick side note on the COVID stuff, it's super hard for people here in the United States. But it's really, really hard for people that live in countries that are dependent on tourism. Like I have a friend who's in Tanzania. He's a safari guide. They take people out in Land Rovers to the Serengeti National Park and stuff like that. And he makes about $20 a day when he's working. When you make $20 a day in Tanzania, you're actually on the higher end of the income scale, which is really disturbing, actually, when you think about it. And they work about 8 to 10 days a month at that rate. Well, now they're a month and a half, almost 2 months into not making any money. And when you make $20 a day, you live day to day. You don't live paycheck to paycheck. You really live day to day. Now, he's okay-ish because he raises chickens on the side, and so he's got food, right? But there's no money. There's very few things open. The transparency in their government is much, much less than us. They have much less information than we have about what's going on. They don't know how many cases there are. The testing isn't as good. So it's the point that I'm making is like people that are in these developing nations are in actually probably much, much worse situation than what we realize. And maybe one of the biggest lasting consequences of the coronavirus is going to be the devastation it causes economically, not here in the U.S., which, I mean, obviously that's significant. I'm not minimizing that. But in places like Egypt or Tanzania and China, I think is going to have some serious issues too. Australia, the other thing that I had on my slide, probably come out okay on that. So, well, we're going to go back to my presentation. I decided to switch over to you just for fun for a second. I hope that was all right with you. Glad you weren't. What's that?
No, I bet that like even in LDCs, like just less developed countries, not so much third world, but even less developed countries are going to have some of those same issues going on. Because like my sister-in-law's husband posted, they're in Saudi right now. They took a job there for a few years. And she was saying that like they have drone attacks that just are a little too close for comfort. And like they are on full 24-hour curfew. They can only leave between certain hours. And the availability of information there is very different from
well, your Islamic world countries, they tend to control information a lot more than what we do. They don't have, and China as well, by the way. I mean, in China, Google's blocked. Like it doesn't exist. Like you can't use Google in China. There's and Facebook and WhatsApp blocked. completely blocked from their internet. They have a firewall built in to prevent those sites from even being accessible from mainland China. So yeah, I mean, you know, if you're in a place that's controlling information like that, and then you have, you know, a global problem like we have now, it's gonna, you know, it's gonna create a lot of fear and uncertainty. And yeah, in Kenya and Tanzania right now, you know, they have 3 or 4 hours a day they're allowed to leave the house, and then only if they have permission, or if they have a, you know, one of the few qualified reasons. And then it's, you know, if you get too far away from your house, they're like, well, where are you going? You know, things like that. And there's other things too, like we were talking to a person who runs a charity in Mozambique recently, and this person, Katie, her charity actually helps people, you know, saves people from sex trafficking, actually. So women and children that are being abused, she goes and secures them first, and then helps them, you know, reestablish their lives. But there's a real problem going on now in Mozambique because some of the more radical Islamic people are targeting Christians because they know they're going to be in their homes. So they're leaving and going and attacking people that are in their houses because they know they're going to be there. And of course, there's less people on the streets, so there's less witnesses, and so there's this like huge like social impact of the coronavirus situation that, like, frankly, we're very fortunate that we don't have to deal with here. But you know, it's a global problem. But anyway, so yeah, that's sort of my story in a nutshell. Now, if you want, we can talk about some real estate stuff. So I have 3 topics, and if you know, listen, if we get too far, you know, into this, then we'll just skip one, right? No big deal. So you just tell me if you want to cut it out. But these are the 3 topics that I really felt like talking about today. Spend a little bit more time on my story than I usually do, but I think it's really relevant right now to talk about the real estate market cycle, where we are in the cycle. You know, before the coronavirus, everyone was talking about the real estate market cycle. Oh, we're really late. You know, we're in the 9th inning of this game, and like we're due for a recession. Well, now we're probably in a recession. Right? Like, I think we're in recession right now. I don't know how that impacts the market cycle in real estate, but we're going to explore how we might be able to find out where we really are in the real estate market cycle. We're going to talk about cap rates, not about like what they are in a specific market, but like what they are in general and why they're important. We're just going to spend like 5 minutes on that because I think it's really important. And then we're going to talk about passive investing, which is something you mentioned at the beginning. And one of the things we talk about on the Old-Fashioned Real Estate Show is something we call the passivity scale. And I'm just spend like a couple minutes explaining why I think that's really important when making a decision about how to get started in real estate investing. And I think if you understand these 3 topics, you can probably be successful in any market cycle at any time in any kind of real estate that you want to invest in. So without any further ado, we will start talking about real estate market cycles. So usually when I'm doing this presentation like live in front of a group, you know, we spend a little time asking people how long the real estate market cycle is. And I hear all these different times, like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And then I put up this chart where I say, it looks like 18 years to me, right? And, you know, this chart is from a story or really an essay that was written by Fred Fulvery called The Depression of 2008. Fred Fulvery is an Ivy League professor, economist, and he studied the cycles of construction, business, and land values over a 200-year period. And he came up with this chart. What's interesting about this is when he wrote The Depression of 2008 was 1999. Now, think about that for a second, right? In 1999, he wrote an article called The Depression of 2008. And then, of course, in 2008, we had a huge market correction. And, you know, so to me, when Fred Fulvery talks, I'm interested in hearing what he says because he hit this one right on. Now, that doesn't mean he's always going to be right, but his basic argument was that the normal length of a real estate market cycle is 18 years. And it lags behind the business cycle by just a little bit. So or I mean, it predates the business cycle by just a little bit. So the business cycle actually lags behind that. So like peak land value, real estate prices, sometime around 2006 is when we hit the peak real estate, prices. He predicted this beforehand, and he did this based on his study of long-term economic trends. Based on this, he believes that the next real estate market cycle peak would be 18 years after 2006, which would be 2024. So like people are saying, well, we're way too far into the real estate market cycle, like we're overdue for a correction and, all this stuff. But the reality is, if you look at history, a lot of times it's 18 years. Now, you also look at this chart, you see it's like 18 years, 18 years, 18 years, 17 years, 18 years. Then it's 48 years. Talk about being overdue for a real estate correction, right? But you know what happened between 1925 and 1973 is you had World War II, right? And that messed everything up. It just did. And so, if we have a world war or some other unpredictable thing like a global pandemic, it could mess this up, right? Like we don't know like what the effect of these major world shocks are. And it's really interesting because you hear people comparing the unemployment rate now to the Great Depression, which, also was between 1925 and 1973, right? And like the early part of that. And they're saying that this is proof that like, we're going into a depression or we're going to have a recession that's really deep and really long. And I think no one really knows for sure. I mean, it's impossible to predict, just like it was impossible to predict in 1925 that the real estate market cycle wasn't going to peak for 48 more years. Right. And so my argument would be we might have already hit peak. Could have happened last year. Or a few months ago, right before the global pandemic, or we might be 10 or 15 years from the peak. Like we just don't know at this point, but there are some things we can do to kind of figure out where we are in the market cycle. And it will become much more obvious, once we get 3 or 4 months down the road. And what we're going to look at is we're going to look at this. This is the market cycle quadrants, right? This comes from another professor. This is a Harvard professor from his textbook, real estate finance textbook, where he basically laid out the market cycle in quadrants. And he said, look, it's phase 1, 2, and 3, recovery, expansion, hypersupply, and recession. This to me is maybe the most important chart in all of real estate investing. Because if you understand the X and Y axis of this particular chart, then you can tell exactly where you are in the real estate market cycle at any time. So the X-axis, the horizontal line, right, is long-term occupancy, like average long-term occupancy. That's right here. Can you see my cursor, by the way?
Yeah, this is awesome.
Yeah. So this is really long-term average occupancy, right? So what that means is not like 5-year, 10-year occupancy. That's like 40, 50-year occupancy. So like you're north of Dallas, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's just say Dallas. So, I mean, I know you're a little bit out of Dallas, but like the data is probably easy to find for Dallas, right? So we can look at apartment complex occupancy rates on average over a 25 or 30-year period. It has to be more than 18 years because it has to be longer than the average length of the market cycle, because otherwise you won't know. Best would be like 50 years, right? So if you have this like long-term average, and let's just say for sake of argument that apartment complexes average 95%. And we can narrow it down even further than that. It might be 95% occupancy in Class A apartment complexes in Dallas, right? Let's just say, I don't know what it is. I haven't researched it. I'm blaming this on you because you didn't give me a lot of warning, or I could have looked up this data. But the point is, like, let's just imagine that it's 95%. If right now we measure occupancy at apartments and they're 97%, then we're above that line. If it's 92%, we're below the line, right? So if it's 97% and it averages 95, we know we're in either phase 2 or phase 3. Like for sure, we have to either be in expansion or hypersupply. And then the next variable that we need to know is occupancy going up or is it going down? If we know that, then we know if we're on the right or left side of the vertical line, right? So that's the direction of occupancy line. So if it's going up and we're above average, we're in expansion, okay? If it's going down and we're above average, we're in hypersupply. If it's going down and we're below average occupancy and occupancy still falling, that's recession, right? And it makes sense if you think about it. Like if you're below average occupancy, there's a lot of vacancy, right? And also it's still increasing, then we're in a recession. And the thing is, like, well, we might be in a recession from a traditional economic perspective right now, 2 quarters, consecutive quarters of negative growth. We know that first quarter of 2020 was negative growth because everything shut down at the end of first quarter. Now we're in second quarter and everything's still shut down in a lot of places. So we're going to have negative growth again. So that's the sort of like popular economic definition of recession. But from a real estate market cycle thing, the question is, where's occupancy right now? Right? And what direction is occupancy going in? If we know those answers and we have the long-term average so we can plot it on a chart, we can say with pretty much a lot of accuracy where we are. And, you know, typically you start at 0.1 and you end at 0.16. So like, if we know where we are, and there's a little bit more nuance to this chart, like the difference between 0.8 and 0.9, 0.9 and 0.10, like there are ways to tell that, but it's like way beyond what we can get into in sort of a short conversation. But the point is, if you can understand this chart, if you can wrap your head around it, you can really understand where you are in the market cycle. And it's actually even more interesting than that because you can buy some of this data, right? Like this is an older report that I pulled because it's free. I didn't go buy the report, but here's like a national apartment market cycle analysis using this chart. Okay. So what this is showing in the fourth quarter of 18, so now a year and a quarter ago, it's clearly not relevant, right? The second is that a lot of the apartment markets were at 0.11, some were at 12 and 13, some were even at 14. And this is an older one. I have seen newer ones that have shown that in a lot of ways it's about the same going into this year. So like last year, 2018, pretty much everything was still in expansion or just starting in hypersupply. And what hypersupply means is, by the way, that more supply is coming online, new construction of apartments, more of them are coming online right now than are being absorbed by the market. Right. And I think you're seeing that in big cities, right? I don't know how it is by you, but in Chattanooga, where I live, downtown Chattanooga, there's a bunch of new apartments. There's Class A expensive apartment stuff. It's, you know, they're sitting at 70-80% occupancy in the brand new construction, and they're slowly filling up. But the point is, there's more new construction than there are new people moving into those, right? Yeah. And the reason for that is because when you're above average occupancy, rents are going up, right? And there's a lag to this too, right? So rents are going up, and this is true even in hypersupply. Like if normally you underwrote your deal to say, hey, I want 95% occupancy because that's the average, and you're at 97%, you can raise your rents. You can justify raising your rents. You don't need to be 100% occupied to raise your rents. In fact, if you're above the occupancy that you project, you should be raising your rents because you're not at a market occupancy rate, right? So everyone's rents are going up. We've been seeing this throughout the entire expansion and into the hypersupply phase. Rents are going up. Well, when rents are going up, it creates a powerful incentive for people to start building new construction, right? And the thing about new construction is if you start building an apartment complex today, when is it done, right? Like if you literally decide, I'm going to break ground today, it's going to take you several months, probably a year to get it done. In reality, you didn't start if you broke ground today. You started 6 months or 8 months before. So you start spending money, you buy land, you get your zoning permissions, you get your, you get all of your contractors and stuff lined up, you get all your financing and stuff lined up. So you're maybe a year into it already by the time you break ground, and then you've got another year probably before you're actually done with construction. So it's like a 2-year process. And so what happens is right up until the peak of the rental market, people are starting this, right? Because if rents have been going up for 2 or 3 years, people they're excited to go out and build new stuff. Like the numbers look really good when rents are going up. And the thing that most people don't understand is rents are going to keep going up right until you get to 0.14.